Hello and welcome to Lesson 5 of the UK's Changing Landscapes topic. Last session was the very first session on coastal landscapes. It was a bit of a mammoth session looking at erosion, weathering and mass movement events. Today we're going to continue looking at coastal processes, but this time we're going to be looking at the processes of transportation and deposition or deposition, depending on your politics. So we're going to be looking at the four types of coastal transportation within the waves, which are known as traction, saltation, suspension and solution. We're going to look at the process of longshore drift, which is an incredibly important process and forms the backbone for explanations for a number of landforms. And we're going to look at what causes deposition and also what it is. Okay, so once you've got the title written down, we'll get straight on to the content. So please pause the screen and unpause when you're ready. Okay, so just like the nonsense word I gave you for remembering the processes of erosion, which was hydrabatsol, which remember stood for hydraulic action, abrasion, attrition, solution, there is another nonsense word not to be used in an exam to help you remember the four types of transportation of sediment in the waves, and that is trasalsasol. So trasalsasol, just like hydrabatsol, is an amalgam of all the different words that go into those four processes. So what we've got is traction, tra, saltation, sal, suspension, sus, and solution, sol. Tra, sal, sus, sol. Traction, saltation, suspension, solution. And just like the last session where there is a handout with all of these different types explained already on 365, this is no different. There is another handout with the explanation of these four types of transportation. So when we talk about transportation, we're talking about movement, and we're talking about the movement of sediment in the waves. So once the hydraulic action and abrasion and attrition have done their job of removing material from the cliffs and from the beach, that material then gets moved around within the waves. So the erosion starts and then transportation takes over. And transportation in the waves can be these four things. So traction occurs with the largest sediment, the kind of larger boulders or the big pebbles, which are too heavy for the sea to really pick up unless they've got loads of energy, like in a storm condition. The sea can't do much with it other than maybe just drag it or roll it about. Okay, so the waves will drag and roll larger kind of boulders or pebbles in the waves themselves, and that's traction. Saltation is for the sort of next size of sediment down. It requires a bit less energy, and these are the smaller boulders and the pebbles and sometimes bits of sand, large bits of sand, which can be picked up by the waves but not carried forever. So they get picked up and dropped and picked up and dropped and picked up and dropped, and that causes them to look a bit like they're bouncing actually, but they're not. They're just getting picked up, dropped. So it's smaller than the big boulders that need to be rolled and never leave the seabed, but the sea and the waves are not able to pick up the sediment forever, so they pick it up and drop it. When you get to the smaller bits of sediment, the tiny fragments, the sort of silty bits and the tiny bits of sand, they can be carried in the water all the time. The water's got enough mass to carry them without it being a problem. And so that's what we'd call suspension. They are suspended in the water, in the flow of the water at all times, pretty much. And then solution, you don't actually even see the material in solution. This is a material that's dissolved in the seawater. So again, just like the solution for erosion, it's limestone, chalk, any dissolvable material in the kind of the weak acid of the seawater being dissolved and carried in the flow. So traction, saltation, suspension, solution, all things to be considered, and I use analogies a lot in lessons, so I'll try and give you one here. If you were going around the old 400-metre track on sports day and you were asked to carry a desk with you, some of you, if you're a bit of a weedy, might not be able to pick up that desk. You might have to just push it or shove it or drag it all the way around. Some of you, let's say you get a smaller thing, maybe a box of books full of books, that can be quite heavy over a long period of time, so you might be able to pick it up and carry it for a while, but every now and then you'd have to put it down, have a little rest and then carry on. So that's the example of kind of saltation. Suspension would be if you were asked to run around the track with your mobile phone in your pocket. You can run around all day long with it in your pocket. That's not a problem. You don't really feel the weight of that mobile phone as you run. And again, solution, dissolved material. So that doesn't really work with my running analogy. So don't listen too carefully to that one. So just like the last thing, there's a handout on 365 with all these explanations written on it, and you just need to give me a diagram which helps illustrate that type of coastal transportation. It says erosion on here, it doesn't mean that, it means transportation, so sorry about that typo. Okay, you'll also notice on that diagram I've given you like a little triangle diagram that says how the energy and the size of sediment changes with each of these types of transportation. So complete that task, make sure you've got the notes for these four, and then when you're ready you can unpause the screen and we'll talk about an even more important transportation process occurring at the coast. Okay, now longshore drift is critically important for you to know how this operates and how this process works. So to that end, I need you to have a really detailed diagram and which is annotated and labelled with all the information that you need. So on the screen currently is a diagram which is really handy and really simplified for you, and I would like you to get that diagram in your notes. So this one here, the bottom right, you've got the beach here. You've got arrows that go onto the beach, which have been labelled Swash. Okay, you've got dotted lines that come away from the beach, which have been labelled Backwash. You've got a big arrow that's out to sea, which is labelled Direction of Prevailing Wind. I want you to copy all these labels, by the way. And then you've got another arrow with another label, which is the Direction of Longshore Drift. Okay, so copy this down, pause the screen to get a good version of this diagram. When you're ready, unpause the screen, and then we're going to do something else with the diagram. Okay, so hopefully you've copied pretty much exactly, or as much as you can, that diagram accurately. And by accurate, I mean I want these arrows to be the same, the arrow prevailing wind to be the same direction as the arrows of the Swash, because that's really important. What's also important is that the backwash, the dotted line arrows, they come straight back. It's not a zigzag, okay? It doesn't come off at an angle, it comes straight back. On at an angle, off straight back. On at an angle, off straight back. So make sure your diagram has those. If you've done accidentally and not got these kind of angles right, please correct your diagram. I don't want you to have it wrong. So if you've done it accurately, what I'd like you to do is also now annotate it with a couple of things. Describe what the prevailing wind is, what the swash is, what the backwash is. I'm going to do that for you, don't worry, you just have to write it down. And then you're going to add even more detail about why the swash approaches at an angle, why the backwash would come straight back to the sea, and why some beaches have groins. Okay, so let's start with the first bullet point. The prevailing wind. That word prevailing, a bit of a funny word. It just means the way or the direction the wind normally blows. Okay, so in any one part of the coastline, there is always a dominant kind of or normal, ordinary wind direction that blows. It's when it's the essentially the most common type or direction of wind. So that's how you just label, add that to this particular part of your diagram. Direction of prevailing wind in brackets, the dominant wind direction or the most common wind direction. Okay. If you want to pause the screen, by the way, to add those diagrams or those labels, please do. The swash. Okay, this arrow, which is the waves going onto the beach. The swash is the waves and sediment that go onto the beach. And it's really easy to remember. And again, label that, please. It's really easy to remember because it makes the sound that it makes. So, or it is the sound that it makes. So when you think about, close your eyes, imagine you're on a beach, and as the waves crash up the beach, what sort of noise do they make? Well, they kind of make a swash noise. So that's why we call it the swash. Well, it might not be why, but that's how I remember it. So swash, waves that go onto the beach. The backwash is the waves that come off the beach, or the wave as it moves back towards the sea. Okay, that's what we call it, the backwash. It is coming back to the sea. So again, label that, please. Now we need to add some other details, some more explanations. So back to the swash, which we know is the waves that go onto the beach. Why is it approaching at an angle? Well, simply, the swash is the waves, and the waves are driven and created by the wind, and we're going to do a bit more about that in session 3. So the waves approach the beach at an angle because that's the direction of the wind. Okay, so why do they approach at an angle? Because the wind pushes them in that direction. That's all you need to write. Why does the backwash return straight to the sea? Well, this is obviously going against the wind, and so the wind is clearly not affecting the backwash. There's only one force that can affect the backwash if the wind isn't, and that is gravity. So the reason the backwash returns straight to the sea, because gravity will go straight back to the lowest point possible. So the swash comes on at an angle because the wind is able to push it that way. But the backwash comes off straight because gravity is the strongest force acting on that water. Okay, so add that note. And lastly, why do some beaches have groins? Well, because if this carried on and you didn't stop it, what's going to happen to all this sand eventually? It's going to clear off over here somewhere, maybe further down the coast. And we've already seen from last lesson that having a wide beach protects your cliffs, and it also attracts tourists. So beaches are really a very good thing to try and keep on your kind of coastline. So to stop the longshore drift taking away all your sediment, you build a groin. A groin is a wall that comes out to sea. It's not designed to try and stop the waves hitting the cliffs. It's designed to stop the waves taking away your material by longshore drift. Okay, so groins are some beaches have groins to prevent longshore drift from taking sediment away. Alright, so now we've got a diagram with labels and detailed annotations. So you've now got a fully kind of annotated diagram about longshore drift. Now, I can't stress enough the importance of knowing the process of longshore drift because it forms the basis of explaining a number of landforms that you're going to be looking at in lesson 5. Okay, so just bear in mind this, you need to know this. Okay, if you're just finishing off the notes, please pause the screen, otherwise carry on. So, you could do the memory task, or I could make life easier for you, which I think is what I'm going to do. Deposition. I want you to know what deposition is, and once erosion has produced material from the cliffs and transportation via traction, saltation, suspension, solution and longshore drift have moved it about a bit, at some point that sediment has to be dropped off, and that's what deposition is. Deposition is the depositing or the dropping off of sediment. And the only reason that waves are going to drop off sediment is because they can't hold on to it any longer. Now we need to know, and you need to know, the reasons why sediment cannot any longer carry, waves cannot any longer carry the sediment they've been carrying for all this time. So there are a number of factors that could affect the wave's ability to carry sediment and therefore lead to it depositing it on the coast. Okay, so the reasons why it will happen. Firstly, one, if the swash is stronger than the backwash. So what that means is, we know the swash, okay, because we've seen longshore drift. The waves that carry sediment onto the beach, if they're quite strong, they can take with them lots of sediment. But because the backwash might be a bit weak and feeble, that sediment can't then be carried off again. So if the swash is carrying sediment onto the beach, but the backwash can't take it off because it's not as strong, then it will leave that sediment, it will deposit it on the beach. And that's what we call a constructive wave, one that leaves more sediment on the beach than it takes away. So that's one reason deposition happens. A second reason deposition can happen, if waves enter shallow water. So if the water gets shallower, then the waves that are carrying the sediment will start to hit the bottom, okay, and they'll get friction with the seabed, and because they get friction, they slow down, and they lose their energy, and they lose their ability to carry sediment, so they drop it off as well, okay, so they are unable to carry their sediment because they don't any longer have the energy. So that's why, remember, a beach is really good because it protects the cliffs behind. Waves go over a beach, they lose their energy, they drop their sediment, the beach gets bigger. Another factor is if the waves enter a sheltered area. So if the one before point 2 is where there's friction from below with the seabed, which slows the waves down. The other thing that could slow the waves down is if you don't have as much wind, because that's the thing that makes the waves. So if the sheltered area, like a cove or a bay, means the wind can't really generate big waves. Those waves will die down, they'll drop whatever they're carrying because they can't carry it anymore, they have no energy. And then lastly, the other reason that you might get sediment being dropped off is if there's too much sediment for the waves to carry. So the load is too heavy, and that tends to happen if you've got a mass movement event that occurs that deposits loads of sediment into the sea, which means it can't carry it anymore. It doesn't matter how big the waves are, some of it is going to get deposited. All right. So now I've explained that. You need all the notes. Okay. You don't have to remember it, but just to help you, there's a copy and complete. So I'd like you to copy and complete this to help explain why deposition happens. All the words are above. Okay, there's 12 to fit into those slides, and I've actually just gone through that. And if you want to cheat, you can just go back a slide by rewinding the PowerPoint. Try not to cheat though, because it's probably better for you in terms of your memory and your revision overall. So pause the screen while you complete this copy and complete paragraph, please. And then when you're ready, unpause the screen. Okay, so hopefully you've got a full paragraph which adds to your different transportation methods. And so we are now essentially at the end of the session. I've got a bit of a recap for you for the first 2 sessions of coasts using some anagrams. So on the screen now are several anagrams of key terms and processes that you've encountered over this session and the previous session, and hopefully you're picking up these key terms and you've been jotting them down and keeping a little glossary or something. Okay, or you can look back in your notes. So because you need to understand these key terms, and we've got one more lesson where I'm going to give you even more key terms, not as many but a few more, okay, just to finish us off with our processes. So pause the screen and see how many of these anagrams you can do without looking back in your notes, and I will unpause the screen. Okay, the first one is erosion, then abrasion, solution, deposition, suspension, transportation, hydraulic action, traction, and longshore drift. Okay, so these are just a snapshot of some of the key terms that you've encountered over the last couple of sessions, which again I know is a lot of detail. This is the end of session 2. It's been a lot shorter than session 1, but by now you've been building up a lot of key processes: erosion, weathering, transportation, mass movement, longshore drift, and you're using those, and you will be using those very soon in lesson 4 to help explain why certain landforms occur at the coast. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Make sure your notes are up to date, and when we get back in lesson 3, we'll add a few more notes before we then use our notes to help really just show our knowledge and understanding and put everything together in one place. All right, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.